Hey there. Don't mind me, I'm just admiring my PS5. I love this thing. I can play all the latest games at high res, it's got 4K support, 120Hz, and all at 60 FPS. But I want to play Rugrats Search for Reptar. Now, you would have thought as time goes on and technology becomes more advanced and game consoles become capable of running things such as this, you would think the feasibility of running something like this would be a doddle. Funny thing, no. Unlike other forms of media, video games are developed for specific hardware, and with the very nature of the games industry moving to a new generation of hardware every 6 to 8 years or so, console manufacturers are constantly refining and building their new systems to obviously prioritize running all the new titles for that system, meaning that the new hardware isn't always intended to be compatible with running older games, and to make it so could be very costly or could potentially compromise the system. Well, okay, that's fine, I guess I'll just hook up my old console to my TV, oh fuck. So yeah, unfortunately, much like how the games are developed for the consoles at the time, those consoles in turn are designed to be compatible and displayed on the TVs and monitors at the time, which of course have now themselves become more advanced and less compatible with older consoles. Stupid, pesky technology. Most older consoles were developed with these cables in mind, composite cables, mostly intended for connection to CRT TVs and early flat screens, both of which are no longer produced nowadays. And considering that more modern TVs are more ideal for modern consoles with HDMI becoming the standard, it leaves us with a dilemma in how we can experience all of our games at once, especially for stupid losers like me who still have a physical collection of older games they play regularly. Now of course, most retro diehards tend to source old CRTs to play on for playing older consoles separately to their newer ones. However, for me and likely most people, it's just more convenient and viable to have a way to play all of our games, both old and new, in one up-to-date setup. And so as a result, I've had to experiment with different methods in order to achieve just that. And I'm fairly comfortable with how I've been able to experience all of my collection on my current TV, which only has HDMI inputs. And that's what I want to share with you all, the different options that you have to experiment with so that you can settle on what's right for you, and we'll go into specifics for individual consoles as well. So this now poses the question: how the hell do I play old games? The way I see it, methods of playing older games fall into 4 categories: original hardware, backwards compatibility, re-releases, and emulation. Original hardware is exactly what it is, you play the games on their original consoles. And yeah, that would seem to make the most sense. The game was designed to run on this console, you can be guaranteed it's going to work with no caveats. And plus, for many people, playing the games the way they were intended to be played just feels right. But then I also have to remind you that life is cruel. With composite inputs being nearly non-existent on modern TVs and generally being quite shite when they are included, they're pretty much a no-go. On the other hand, component cables are also an option and will yield a much better picture, though they aren't as readily available for some consoles, and again, most new TVs may not include inputs for them. So if you do want to experience original hardware on your new TV, you're gonna have to find a way to adapt or convert the video output to HDMI, and thankfully the options for doing so are quite versatile. Maybe a bit too versatile. The retro game market has really expanded in the last decade, offering so many damn ways to hook up old consoles to modern TVs. So which ones are the best to use? Well, it depends on the system, and I will go into a bit more depth when I go over consoles individually. But in general, the one thing you should know with all of these options is that you tend to get what you pay for. The cheaper basic HDMI solutions are just that, cheap. The picture quality looks like arse. Now, on the other hand, you do have much higher end cables and upscalers like the OSS-C, the FrameMeister, and the RetroTink, all of which can provide really good video quality, though dependent on what cables and settings you use with them. These aren't quite as simple as a plug-and-play solution and require a bit of experimentation and knowledge on how to use them. And then the cream of the crop is console mods, kits that can be installed into your console to tap into the video output directly. This will provide the best image possible from them, though at the biggest cost, even more so if you need someone to install it for you, which I highly recommend if you aren't very experienced in this field, since it can be a very delicate process. One thing to keep in mind though, despite what I have just said, just because an adapter or cable or any other solution is expensive does not necessarily guarantee that it will be good. There are some solutions out there that I feel are way too extortionate considering the quality you get from them. Take the M cable for example, that in my opinion, despite the very premium look of the branding and the cables themselves, they really do not justify the ridiculous retail price they ask for considering the video quality they provide. Ultimately, when trying to play original hardware on modern TVs, since there are so many solutions, each with their own variables to consider, I highly recommend doing some research to see which ones work best for you in terms of visual quality and price. Then you have backwards compatibility, very simply new consoles being able to run your older discs from prior generations. In an ideal world, this would be the best way to experience older titles, but then again stupid shit like Stadia exists, so idealism is but a pipe dream. Now this tends to cross over with the other three categories, since to achieve backwards compatibility, a console may use a form of emulation or include elements of a previous console's hardware to run the games, and with backwards compatibility on the system, they may re-release older titles. Now, with the more recent 8th generation and the current 9th generation of consoles, backwards compatibility with physical media is much more scarce or just very limited, and it's a possible unfortunate telling of where the industry may be going, though there are of course still options. Then with re-releases, it's self-explanatory. The older games get re-released on modern platforms because nostalgia is one hell of a monetizable bitch. This has seemingly become the new industry standard, even not taking into account or considering things like remakes to be part of this. Old games are constantly getting re-released and ported to other systems, either on their own or as part of collections. They do this because 1, it's normally a very easy and quick way of getting content out, and 2, if there's one thing I know about gamers, despite how much we bitch and moan about this shit, we know we'll still buy it. They wouldn't keep releasing these if we didn't. I mean, take me for example, I bought Monsters Inc. Scare Island on PS1 and PS2. I'm not a psychopath, I swear. Now granted, there are some benefits to games being re-released like this. Often they are upscaled to look and run much better, and some ports even have gameplay tweaks and overhauls to improve the experience, and even sometimes add extra content. And for some people, having all these games as part of collections or just on modern systems is a more convenient and easy way to play these games, hence why they sell like hotcakes. As well as this, the trend of classic mini consoles like the NES and SNES Classic are cool little novelties, and they can be a great way for newer players who have never experienced these games before to try them out in a more faithful way. On the other hand, it could be like charging 60 quid for a game when I can already play it in HD for a third of the price and it would probably look the same. The fuck? Then finally, emulation, Nintendo's big no-no word. Using emulation software to simulate the hardware to run old discs or ROMs has been around as far back as the mid to late 90s. It's an extremely common way for many people to experience old games, since they can use the software to make the games look extremely clean and crisp, beating out anything you could ever achieve with original hardware. And just having it easily accessible on your PC or perhaps something like a Raspberry Pi is again very convenient if you're not really into physical games. And in my eyes, emulators are decent, especially when it comes to playing games only released in other regions. However, I try to avoid using them if I can, and being on PC, there are more variables that can go wrong with it, at least in my experience. I've rarely had an issue-free experience with emulation, despite my best efforts, be it a graphical glitch or frame rate problem. And then there's the legality of it all. Now, for most people, they still do it regardless and don't seem to care, since it really is a grey area. If you want to go for it, by all means, just do it at your own risk. And no one wants to be known as the guy doing time for playing Garfield 2 in 4K. So with each of those 4 categories in mind, and with all the variables and sub-options to consider with all of them, which which is the best to go for? Well, most of the time it really comes down to personal preference and will vary depending on what console and games you want to play. So, taking what we have to work with, let's go over as many old consoles as we can from the 6th generation prior, and see which ways work best for each system and what my preferred way is. So let's get the fossiliest fossils out the way first, the Atari 2600. Now, part of that Atari charm does come from the original hardware. That wood finish look just has so much personality. But really, if you're trying to get an Atari 2600 to work on a TV like this, you are fucking insane. Let's be real here, with a console as old as this, the easiest and most convenient way to play Atari games now are via re-released collections. Atari games are re-released like this all the damn time on most systems, though if you are looking for a more console-like experience, you could try the Atari flashback systems. Essentially the Atari version of the SNES and NES Classic, you'll get most of the same games that you would with a console collection. And even a clone console like the Retron line from Hyperkin would suffice if you want to use physical cartridges. Really though, when the games are about as intense as this, I don't really think it's a huge detriment to not play this on original hardware. For me, re-releases do just fine. So from now on, I'm gonna do this by console manufacturer rather than release date, and seeing as how they're no longer in the console game anymore, let's take a look at Sega. The Genesis, or the Mega Drive as it's known here in the UK, has a few more options available for it. If you want to play original cartridges on the system, upscalers like the FrameMeister and OSSC do really well with 16-bit and 8-bit sprite-based games. Though if you're looking for a more simple plug-and-play solution, the Rad2X cables for the Genesis might be a good shout, albeit only working exclusively for that console. Or again, you could try a clone console using the Retron line from Hyperkin once more as an example. Keep in mind though that some of these consoles may stretch the aspect ratio of the gameplay automatically. It's not a huge detriment, but if that kind of thing bothers you, then yeah. However, if there's few things in life that are certain, it's death, taxes, and a Sega Genesis collection on every damn console imaginable. If you're someone looking to get into Genesis games, these collections will sort you fine. They have most of the notable Genesis titles, and are available on nearly every damn system. But if you do want a bit more of a retro flair, the classic mini consoles once again pose a good option. And for me personally, these kind of methods do the job. But then this raises the question, what if you want to play the Sega Saturn? I've always wondered what it feels like to be a console ruined before it even came out by a fucking number. 299. Now honestly, the solutions here are very similar to the Genesis, with upscalers and another Rad2X cable for the Saturn. I only really mentioned the Rad2X cable as an example because it seems to be the most high-profile, high-end cable on the market at the moment. But again, the prominent titles, from what few there were, like Nights into Dreams, Virtua Fighter, and Panzer Dragoon, have all again been re-released on newer consoles already. So I've kind of gotta say sorry to all 4 of the Saturn fans out there, the hardware is just pretty useless. But now onto the Dreamcast, everyone's favourite console they keep forgetting ever existed. I do feel kind of bad for the Dreamcast. It was a cool little console, but I guess it always felt overshadowed by the vastly more successful PS2, Xbox, and Gamecube, as well as having to follow one from the Saturn being, what's that word, oh yeah, shit. Now there's not too many well-known high-end adapters or cables from the console specifically that I can really think of, but there does exist a mod known as the DC HDMI by a modder known as Citrus 3000, which does provide the best video quality output you can get from it natively. Again though, it being a mod, it is costly, and even more so if you need to have it installed for you, so it's definitely only an enthusiast level thing. But yet again, the Sega re-releases reared their head. Like all the previous consoles, Sega have re-released the majority of the notable titles on the system. Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Crazy Taxi, Shenmue 1 and 2, Jet Set Radio, and Soul Calibur among others, with the only real notable omission being Seaman. God forbid I can't have Seaman. But really, the main takeaway from Sega's consoles is that I think re-releases seem to be the most ideal way. Because they're not in the console market anymore, they are more than happy to keep bringing back their titles to modern systems constantly, and well, yeah, you can of course try the original hardware solutions. If you want to go for the most convenient way for a modern setup, I think re-releases are the way to go for Sega's consoles. So now let's move on to Sony, the main consoles I grew up with. This is more my bread and butter, so I'm a little more well versed in this. Now both the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 share a lot of the same solutions, but we'll still look at them individually. Firstly, the PlayStation, my favourite console of all time. Now granted, the early 3D polygonal look hasn't aged too well, but I don't know, I love the charm of it personally. Though because of this graphical style, upscalers, from what I've seen from various footage, it can really vary depending on the cables used and what settings you have. The plug and play solutions are a bit more limited as well. For about 30 quid there's the fairly well known Easy Solution pound cable, which also works for the PS2, and it certainly looks like an easy 30 quid solution. Rad2X once again produced some cables for this console, giving some pretty good results from what I've seen. But if you really want the best of the best from playing the original system, Citrus 3000 once again delivers with the PS1 digital mod. And to be honest, the results really do speak for themselves, and again, the only problem being, yeah, I'm sure I've got a spare kidney knocking around here somewhere. Emulation for this system is also notoriously easy, and there's many options out there, with EPSXE seemingly being the main go-to for most. And I guess there's also the PlayStation Classic mini console, so you either have the choice of buying that or retaining your dignity. For my money though, I personally think backwards compatibility is the way for this console. Now of course we know the PS5 and PS4 can't play original PlayStation games, even though it turned out the PS4 had a native PS1 emulator built in, they just couldn't be asked to fully implement it. The fuck, Sony. However, it is widely known that every model of the PS3 can play PS1 discs, and to be frank, I think PS1 games look really good on a PS3. It's upscaled to 1080p, and you have the option to add a smoothing filter, but honestly it does kind of just make your games look blurry. And you can stretch it to full screen if you want, but that also makes it look pretty horrible. If you turn off smoothing and keep the original aspect ratio, the PS3 I think provides a great way to play original PS1 discs, and the quality isn't that far off from what the PS1 digital provides. It looks really crisp and clean to me, and since the PS3 can play these games, there are several high-profile classic PlayStation titles available to download from the PS3 store. Now onto the PS2, with it being a very similar situation in terms of upscalers, in that it really does vary in the quality. Though like the Dreamcast, there's not really any high-end cables or adapters that improve the picture that I can think off the top of my head. And PS2 emulation, for me at least, I find way more finicky and unstable. I don't know if it's just me, but I've never managed to get it to work properly. But once again, the PS3 really does come into its own. Throughout the PS3's life cycle, several HD collections of many well-known PS2 franchises were released. Ratchet & Clank, God of War, Jak and Daxter, Devil May Cry, Metal Gear Solid, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, Silent Hill, Okami, Sly Cooper. They're all here, and the HD collections are readily available and provide a great way to experience these games. Now the PS4 and PS5 do have a very few select PS2 titles, either via download or via PlayStation Now. But with how few there are, and considering that they're not always the best optimized, it doesn't really make them a great option as such. I mean, Jak and Daxter on PS4 looks and runs worse than the PS3 ports. Like, what? How the fuck did they manage that? However, if you want to play your PS2 discs, then the PS3 also features backwards compatibility for that as well, if you have the right model. Some of the earlier fat model PS3s contained actual PS2 hardware to run these games, though they did change it to partial emulation to cut costs before removing it altogether. And much like the PS1, PS2 games look really good here. In fact, with the PS2 games, the smoothing feature actually helps improve the look of the games, it seems. So all in all, the PS3 really is my ideal way to experience PlayStation's back catalogue, with turning off the smoothing feature for PS1 games and turning it on for PS2 games, with the re-releases being a great HD option as well. I know the PS3 systems that are backwards compatible with both aren't that easy to get a hold of, but if you're interested in playing your physical game disc through HDMI, then this is a really solid option. Let's also quickly take a sidestep into the PS2's main competitor, the original Xbox. Now, to be able to play a lot of these titles in HD would be great, especially since multi-platform games tended to look best on this system. However, the options are unfortunately a lot scarcer for this console. For the original hardware, upscalers are perhaps the only decent option, since there's no real notable good quality HD cables or adapters, though there are some some HDMI mods, albeit they are still in development. PC emulation for the Xbox is also kind of non-existent, or at least very iffy for the most part, and original Xbox games aren't really re-released too often either, so that leaves us one other option. And thankfully we're in luck, since the 360 is backwards compatible with original Xbox games. Oh, this has got to be the 6th most disappointing moment of my life. Okay, when I say backwards compatible, I am telling the truth if your definition of backwards compatibility is just over half the original library. So only 461 games out of 997 are actually playable. Though to add salt to a wound, a substantial amount of them also experience varying issues when played on a 360. On the list of backwards compatible games, there's a whole ass column for listing the issues, for God's sake. However, when it does work, it really does work well, and the games end up looking fantastic. Now with the Series X and Xbox One, they too are also compatible with select original Xbox titles, however it's to an even lesser extent with only 42 games. This time however, each one of these games are optimized to ensure it runs perfectly, so you can at least be guaranteed that it will run without any hiccups. For me though, the 360 personally works fine. Most of the games I play on there don't experience any issues, and if they do, they're often very small. So let's move on to the final of the big boys in the console market. Yes, it's that time. I'm gonna tell you how to play old Nintendo games. Oh. Yeah, Nintendo's attitude to some parts of their legacy absolutely fucking baffles me sometimes. If you so much as dare to attempt to have fun, they roll in with the say hello to my little DMCA. And yet they rarely provide much of an alternative themselves to deter people from downloading and emulating ROMs. But regardless, we'll start with both the NES and SNES together, since the ways you can play these games on modern setups are incredibly similar. Now, with how much of a legacy these consoles have left, and considering how long they've been around, so many alternatives for playing these games exist, and most of them are perfectly viable. Upscalers do wonders for this era of graphics, retro clone consoles work really well, though they may manipulate the image, and emulation is so widely available. And joking aside, Nintendo seems to flaunt this era of their backlog the most, providing a fair few ways to experience them themselves, with Virtual Console, the mini consoles, and as part of the Switch's online service. And all of these work just as well as each other, and it's just down to what works for you. Me personally, as someone who never grew up with these games, the mini consoles provide a selection that shows the best of what they had to offer with that retro style experience. Now when you get to the 3D consoles, there is a much more drastic drop in options here. The N64 is a console known for not looking good on most modern setups, and outside of emulation, the few ways of playing these games with good quality that are available are unfortunately all very expensive. The Ultra HDMI mod, while great, is way too pricey and way too hard to get hold of, and most decent HDMI adapters are way too costly, especially for what you get from them. And it sucks because N64 games have rarely been re-released on modern systems, so it's not really looking great. But there is a slight saving grace, and prepare yourself because it comes from the Wii U. Hear me out on this. The Virtual Console on the Wii does have a decent selection of the main Nintendo IP N64 games. Granted, the visual quality isn't perfect, but it's better than what most other solutions offer. And for the Rare developed games, the Xbox Live Arcade and Rare Replay are the only real re-release options out there. However, I should note that Hyperkin are in production of a clone console for the system to use your cartridges on. Granted, it does use emulation to play the games, which I understand may be divisive, but as long as it looks good, I'm fine with that, and I'm definitely going to keep my eye on this. But now let's move on to the Gamecube, and man, this is where the options really start to bottleneck. I myself am currently looking into starting playing Gamecube, and looking for ways to play it on modern setups was partly the inspiration for this video. Now, the Dolphin emulator has been a very popular way for experiencing this console via emulation, but from Nintendo themselves, they tend to act as if this console never existed unless they're cashing in on Smash players, as well as there's even fewer Gamecube games have been re-released. And the main way to get the best quality from the original hardware outside of using an upscaler are component cables, which are extremely rare and expensive. Now, a company called Eon, who also did develop a HDMI adapter for the N64, also produced one for the Gamecube, and the Gamecube version, from what it seems, tends to output a component level signal via HDMI. And so because of that, I would say this is the best option to go, but then you have the Harby adapter. This does the exact same thing that the Eon adapter does, but just for half the price. And it literally contains the exact same technology the Eon one does, so please just save yourself some money and go for this one instead. Now finally, let's tidy this all up in a nice little bow with the console named after piss. The Wii was Nintendo's vastly successful first step into not trying to conform to the normal console fare of the time, and instead just doing their own kooky and eccentric thing. Now I need to say, Nintendo, I love the fact that you're not normal. I enjoy your weird own way of doing things. It's your thing, but good God, why can't you just be normal? So yeah, despite being in the same generation as the PS3 and 360, this doesn't have HDMI and still uses composite output. The Dolphin emulator, like the Gamecube, is the main emulation option available. And once again, there's not too many options in regards to high quality adapters or cables that I can think of. God, I am so tired. But suddenly, once again, from the grave, the Wii U rises up to give us a second reason for still using it. And hey, it's 2 more reasons than I thought there would be. So the Wii U is backwards compatible with all Wii games in its Wii mode. Essentially, it kinda has a Wii built into it, with the benefit of still being able to use the Wiimote and nunchuck, and with it being able to output in HDMI, and the games do look way better than they do on an original Wii. Honestly, the Wii U is a surprisingly good way of experiencing Nintendo's older content, seeing as the Switch currently lacks quite a lot of these options. It is a bit of an unsung hero for its vast ways of playing older games, especially for being arguably the company's biggest flop. And at last, that brings us to an end. Now, of course, it needs to be said, all the options and the ways I've shown you here are mainly just the more well-known methods and only just scratch the surface. With the way the retro gaming market has just exploded in recent years, it's brought so many alternatives for us to experiment with. And when all is said and done, there isn't really a correct way to go about it. Go for the solutions that work best for you. For me, I'm very content with mine. I recommend doing a fair bit of research into the consoles you want to play though. Channels like My Life in Gaming, Digital Foundry, Modern Vintage Gamer, and Metal Jesus Rocks, to name a few, have so many videos going more in depth on the specifics of these, and I have used some footage from their videos here as examples, so please do check them out. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with the solutions I have to play my old games. And you know what? I am gonna play Rugrats Search for Reptar in high res. I'm a grown-ass man, damn it! I guess I'll just emulate it. I mean, come on, what's the worst that's going to happen? Oh. So what are you in for?
Playing Garfield 2 in 4K.
Ugh. Fucking scumbag.